Hello and welcome back to the How to Be Good podcast, the show where we speak to people and businesses that are looking to help combat the climate crisis and live a more sustainable life.
And today we have Thomas Mortlock. He's a senior risk scientist at Risk Frontiers. This is our second interview with Tom.
Just in case you recognise the name.
He's here to update us and make us understand why the extreme weather events are happening across the globe and just give us more details.
Absolutely. And we've all seen it on the news over the last couple of months, from the fires that wiped out whole towns in Canada to the floods in Northern Europe, in Germany and other areas as well, and also just devastating whole towns and villages there as well, right the way over to in China as well, and horrendous, and even flash floods in London that is pretty unprecedented. I think I saw rivers of water going down Stratford Station.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And there's also fires now in Greece and Turkey. Right. There's immense loss to humans, but also let's not forget about the loss of biodiversity, the loss of habitats for wildlife. To actually the ocean warming in the heat wave areas so much that it has caused a massive loss of animals around the area.
It's a huge effect on humans, but it's also a huge effect on the animals and wildlife, and as you said, the full biodiversity. So anyway, let's hear to a more scientific standpoint of why this is happening from Thomas Mortlock.
Let's get on with the show.
Absolutely. Hello and welcome back to the How to Be Good podcast. And today really is a welcome back because we have Thomas Mortlock again onto our show to help us understand more about what is happening with the weather at the moment. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me back, both. It's good to be back.
Absolutely, good to have you. So, could you tell us a little bit about all these extreme weather events happening throughout the globe, and why are we getting these such extreme events?
Yeah, sure. It certainly has been an interesting few weeks or even a few months. It all really kicked off at the end of June with a big heatwave event that occurred in Canada and in Washington State and down to Oregon in the US, which was called a heat dome. And it really was a very unusual event. It caused temperature anomalies of over 20 degrees, which means temperatures themselves reached above 40, but the anomaly is a really good way of measuring it because that's the amount over what is normally felt. So 20 degrees over what is normal. Wow. There over the average is really a very, very extreme event with some implications for human health, and there were over 500 excess deaths, so deaths related to the heat waves there. That in itself was certainly an extreme and abnormal event. A couple of weeks after that, you will have seen in the news that there was some very damaging flooding that occurred in northwest Europe. So principally in Germany, but also the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg also experienced flooding. And really some of the worst floods in living memory. In terms of the Air River, which was one of the major rivers in Germany that was affected, the previous flood of record was 3.7 meters. This flood reached a height of 8 meters, and wow. If you saw some of the before and after images, they're just even from a hydrologist perspective, they are really quite impressive. The size of the river channel prior to flooding compared to the area that was flooded afterwards is really quite immense. And often we measure these river floods in terms of discharge, which is the amount of volume of water that flows through a given point. And the Meuse River, which you may or may not be aware of, is one of the major river systems in Europe. It flows through, I think, 5 or 6 different Western European countries. That had a discharge of 3,000 cubic meters a second. And to put that into perspective, that's only happened twice since 1911. And the 2 times it's happened previously has been in the European winter. So to get that kind of volume occurring during the summer is highly unusual. So we had that occurring. They were the two, I guess, headlines. At exactly the same time, temperature records were being set in Ireland, had the hottest day in Ireland since records began. Flash flooding occurred in London. That's only happened a couple of times over the past several decades. That's quite unusual as well.
Yeah.
But then a couple of weeks after that, you will have also seen in the news that Zhengzhou in central China, I'll probably pronounce that wrong, but a major urban area in central China experienced some very strong rainfall and subsequent flooding. The Weather Bureau there estimated the intensity of rain at that location at the time was a 1,000-year event, so something that might only be expected to occur once every 1,000 years. So at face value, 3 or 4 extreme events that impacted a wide range of areas across the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's I've got so many questions, but we understand that time is tight on this. But there seems to be an almost like a central band globally of flooding, and then we're having extreme temperatures both north and south of that across the globe. And are they all connected in terms of like the shifting weather pattern and rainfall and airflow?
Yeah, so these events certainly were connected, and it was connected via a mechanism called the jet stream, which may be familiar to you. The jet stream is a band of wind, basically, in the lower atmosphere that moves weather systems along across the mid-latitudes. There's jet stream in the southern hemisphere as well, and one's close to the equator, but the one that was responsible for these events essentially moves weather systems across North America, across Europe, across the mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere, which also includes China as well. Now, when it's flowing quickly, it's kind of akin to a river. When it's flowing quickly, it moves weather systems on quite fast, and this is why in Northwest Europe you tend to get quite changeable weather quite a lot, because these systems move in across the Atlantic, and they're transported with the jet stream. But what can happen is that the jet stream, just like a river, can become very sinuous. So it can become very curvy, basically. And you can visualize it like a wave. These curves can break like an ocean wave. And when they do break, they can cause anomalous weather. When they become very sinuous, just like a river, they can cause cut-offs. So, you can have these things called oxbow lakes in a river where when it becomes very sinuous, you actually get an area that gets cut off from the main river channel. It's exactly the same with this atmospheric rivers, they're called. And so when it does become very sinuous, you often get blocking patterns. So weather systems stay in one place for a very long period of time. And it can also draw in anomalous weather from latitudes north and south. So, for example, the heat wave in Canada was bringing in very warm, dry air from the south that is anomalous to that location. Similarly, back in February, when we had the Texas snowstorm, you might remember, that was also related to a very sinuous pattern in the jet stream. It was bringing in very cold air from the Arctic region, but it was a very similar pattern. So, again, the sinuosity of the jet stream was also related to the flooding in Northwest Europe and into China as well. So it's certainly a linked pattern between those three events.
Not knowing a lot about weather and extreme weather events, I wanted to ask, is this a pattern? Does this happen every 100 years or is this completely unprecedented?
No, it's not unprecedented. I mean, the jet stream is a big part of us understanding climate and weather across the globe. It's very difficult, and often I guess people jump on individual weather events and say that there's a climate change component to it. I mean, certainly we can say with high degree of certainty that climate change and increasing global temperatures will make extreme weather more likely. How we say they affect individual weather patterns themselves is still very difficult to model. So we can talk in terms of probabilities, but how they actually affect individual weather patterns is still something that's an area of science in progress, I guess. But there's been a lot of research to suggest that there's something called Arctic amplification. So the Arctic area is warming faster than any other part of the globe. And we're seeing that in terms of ice loss. And when we lose ice, something called a positive feedback occurs. So there's a reduction in albedo. So when we have ice, it's very reflective, it's white, it reflects a lot of the sun's energy and warmth back into the atmosphere. But when we lose that albedo, when the ice melts, the surface becomes darker, heat is absorbed more at that surface, and it's a positive feedback. This thing just gets bigger and bigger. More warmth means more ice loss means more warmth. And so this is why we're getting, one of the reasons why we're getting warming in the Arctic that is greater than the global average. But what that is also doing is it is reducing the temperature differential between the Arctic region and the subarctic regions, or the mid-latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. And the jet stream is kept in place by this temperature differential.
Right.
So if the difference between these two areas of temperature is reducing, then you can expect probabilistically that the jet stream may slow down. Right. It may become more sinuous. It may, move all over the place, just as we see with a river, for example, that has less flow through it. And unfortunately, these sinuous patterns, the slowing down of the jet stream, the blocking effect that it can lead to these extreme anomalous weather conditions that we've seen over the past month.
Yeah. We have been told in other interviews about the Earth's tipping points. Is this a result of having hit some of these tipping points, such as the ice melting and the tundra and so on?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a very timely one, actually, because in the next couple of weeks, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is about to release their 6th assessment report. And these are real milestones in terms of a synopsis of where climate science is and informing policy. And one of the major messages coming out of the AR6 will be about tipping points. And tipping points are essentially unknowns in the climate system. They are things like positive feedback effects, like I just described. Especially for Australia, for example, the unknowns we don't really know how Antarctica responds to warming. We don't know when ice sheet instabilities will occur, how they're going to occur. But unfortunately, they are tipping points, because we could be planning for sea level rise that doesn't account for massive ice shelf loss from Antarctica. But when we put that into the equation, then the amount of sea level rise could be much larger. So it's very difficult from a risk manager's perspective to factor all that uncertainty in, because we don't know the time frame, or we can't really assign a probability to it. So, with regard to tipping points, unfortunately, it is something that we certainly need to bear in mind, that science is not climate science is not a complete science, and these are gaps in our knowledge that unfortunately we're just going to have to deal with somehow. In our projections.
Absolutely. So we're also reading lots and lots of reports. We get heat waves and billion-dollar extreme event floods and so forth. How can countries be better prepared for this to mitigate it in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we look at disaster losses, and we do have a good record of disaster losses in Australia and globally, and they go back to, pretty well, they go back to the 70s in terms of the economic losses that are associated with natural disasters. And when we normalise that loss record for present-day conditions, present-day GDP, population, etc., we actually don't see much of a trend in there. And the reason for that is that the cost of extreme weather is as much about where and how we choose to live as it is the change in the hazard. That's certainly not to say, and it shouldn't be misinterpreted to mean that there's no climate change signal in there. What it really means is that we are perhaps becoming better at dealing with these events in some instances. Certainly in some areas of the world that's not the case. So I mean, I can only speak to the Australian context, and if we take coastal, for example, in some areas of Australia, we are living with a legacy of inappropriate development in the coastal zone, and we need to deal with those situations today in the best and most sustainable way that we can. But unfortunately, a lot of the adaptation and mitigation decisions that are made will come back to a present-day cost-benefit analysis. So, is it more cost effective for me to put a seawall in and maintain the coastal line than it is for compulsory purchase and move the line landward, let's say. So individual decisions at a local scale, but I think certainly we are beyond the point of thinking that climate change and the effect on extreme weather is something for the future. We know that it's happening now. And certainly people are planning for that already.
Can we expect these events that we've been talking about now, the floods and the fires and the same bands, to be more frequent in the next years to come?
Again, it's very difficult to say on individual events, but if I talk to the Australian example, again, or even globally, the major premise is something called the Classis-Clapeyron relation, which relates the amount of water vapor in the air to temperature. And essentially, as the atmosphere warms, there is more potential for the atmosphere to hold more water. And on that premise alone, at a very high level, you might expect that either the magnitude or the frequency of extreme rainfall and associated flooding may increase. There's a lot more things going on at the local and the regional scale. For example, in Australia, on a year-to-year or multi-year cycle, we're very much affected by what's going on in terms of climate variability, what's happening with oscillations in the Pacific, with the Indian Ocean, with the Southern Ocean. And that, on the short term, can mask a climate change signal. But it really depends how long we project out for. If we're looking out several decades to centuries, then certainly we can see a signal come through. But the kind of results that we're seeing from our models is that in terms of the financial implications associated with extreme weather and climate change, bushfire is an outstanding hazard. We're certainly seeing the largest associated losses projected into the future with bushfire. A little bit less so with flood, for that exact reason I've just mentioned, in terms of it being very affected by these year-to-year oscillations in regional climate.
So you've just released a briefing. So if people want to understand a little bit more, how can they read it? How can they get more up to date?
Yeah, sure. So it's on our website, riskfrontiers.com/insights. All of our briefing notes are up there. It was really a commentary of the event and the fact that it's interconnected. I think that in itself is probably an interesting aspect of those 3 or 4 events. But really pulling it back to something called peril correlation and compounding. So when we treat natural hazard events in risk assessments, we often think of them in isolation. We plan for a flood or we plan for a bushfire. We don't necessarily plan for a flood following a bushfire or vice versa. So this is called compounding, and there certainly is evidence that certain natural hazards are correlated or anti-correlated. I mean, often, bushfires and floods are 2 ends of the spectrum. But you might expect, for example, tropical cyclones and flooding to happen at the same time. So it's really just highlighting the fact that we should be also thinking about compound events, and also just at a very high level understanding that the climate is a global system, and extreme weather and climate hazards are linked by these pan-hemispheric mechanisms like the Rossby waves, like the jet streams. So we can't think about climate risk in isolation for any one location. It's all very much a global system and linked. And the difficult, I guess, and also interesting thing about working in this space is that it's not wholly predictable. We have a climate system that is stochastic, which basically means it's semi-chaotic. You can, and again, the jet stream is a very good example of this, the butterfly effect. You can have a random perturbation of the jet stream somewhere in the world, and that sets off this atmospheric wave. The wave can break, do weird things, and amplify in other parts of the world. So, yeah, it's an exciting time to be in this space. But I think if there's any one message, it would be that climate science is doing the best it can, but there is a whole bunch of uncertainty around any one projection you might read about in the news.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for being on the show again and for giving us an insight into the weather events that we've all been experiencing recently, and some more than others, and helping us understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's been a good conversation, and look forward to our next chat.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully it's not just around weather events all the time. Hopefully we're not having lots and lots of people in disaster zones, but unfortunately things aren't great.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So that was Thomas Mortlock, Senior Risk Scientist from Risk Frontiers. And it was really good to get an understanding of how I'm not very good at understanding his terms, or remembering his terms, but the oscillation of weather events as well, and how the jet streams being slowed up can cause so much other effects, much the same as rivers and things like that. And it's interesting to understand the science, but also the overall risk of weather, because it isn't an exact science, but all these things are cumulating. No, how do I say it? Cumulative has an effect on the environment.
I think it's very interesting to understand how connected the fires and the heat waves are to the flood areas, and also to understand that the weather is chaotic, and we have to prepare for it. We've got to understand that this can happen anytime, and with the climate change and the weather warming, we will see more of these in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that does worry me, and the question you asked was regarding the tipping points, and Thomas talked about it specifically with regard to the vast amount of ice melt that's happening, and we've heard this from a number of other guests as well. It does worry me a lot because it's a bit unknown as to what those effects are going to be. All we do know is they're not going to be good.
And I think as we've understood from previous interviews, is that the tipping points are things that we cannot control. Whilst at the moment we can still control the amount of CO2 we emit, we can still control the amount of forests we cut, the amount of fishing we do, the amount of meat we eat. These are all things that we control. As soon as the tipping points start happening, we'll lose the ability to control any of the CO2 emissions from these areas and any of the extreme weather events.
Absolutely. And we spoke more about the tipping points with Dr. Shahir Masri in that episode. I believe it was 23, but I could be wrong. So maybe we'll put a link to that in the bottom. But
Climate Action 101.
Climate Action 101 was the episode title. Well done. So it was certainly worth looking or listening, obviously YouTube or podcast, to listen to what he had to say as well. And the two work very closely together with understanding the tipping points and the effects that these are going to have on our planet and us and everything.
And as always, we can only do this podcast because of your support. If you want to donate or be one of our patrons and get involved in the podcast, come up with ideas and support us, please go to our page, www.howtobegood.com.au, and click support us, and it will take you to either Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. We love coffee. And there's also PayPal as well, if you'd like to support us, or just share with your friends. Contact us and tell us what we're doing good and what we're not doing so good. So just join us.
Absolutely. So we'll put the details for Risk Frontiers because they've just submitted that briefing, and so we'll put a link to the briefing note as well in the show notes. And I think that's more or less it. Us covered.
Yes, indeed. Till next time.
Till next time. Hopefully we got it right. I'm not sure if we always get it right at the end. Till next time. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.